Thank you very much for Mr. Letta and the views that he expressed. And now here's a question to Minister Eide. He clearly, and correct me if I'm wrong since you're first row, but to me it seemed that Mr. Letta said this has been obviously a successful single market, but there are a number of transformations that will need to take place. And this is a moment sort of transformation, that would be the word. How would, in the context of the EFTA, what would you bring to the table? How do you fit into this moment of transformation, would you say?
Well, absolutely, you're right. And let me answer that. Let me just 20 seconds to say one thing about history, because I do remember the time before the EEA. And I remember the early days of talking about this, which was in February '89, at a time where the EEC were 12 and EFTA were 7. So the three of us plus Sweden, Finland, Austria, and Switzerland. And EFTA was then the largest trading partner of the 12, much more than the US, for instance. And at the time, nobody thought Slovakia or anybody else from what was Eastern Europe, in quotation marks, would ever join, because it was a different world. So this is the origins to connect the EFTA side to the EU and jointly make a single market. Now, the world has, of course, changed tremendously since then. 27 EU countries, 3 of us, great countries, but only 3, but making 30. And I remember, when we finally managed to launch EEA, it was in a world that was opening up to trade. The WTO came the next year. The previous GATT turned into WTO. Globalization was coming. It was for the future. And people traded with everybody on the planet. So this was kind of a microcosm of better trade relations in the world. Now it's a very different world, because we have geopolitical tensions. The WTO is, sadly, in a deep crisis. We have climate challenges and so on top of the geopolitical challenges. So the single market has to deliver on many more purposes than just the reduction of non-tariff barriers to trade, which was the original idea. So it's totally much more than a market. It is a market, and we're proud that it's a market, but there's much more to it than that. And just only today in the EEA Council, which I think was one of the most lively and interesting we've had, we discussed exactly this. How do we deal with the deteriorating situation of the world, or the deteriorating situation of global trade, but also international law, and how can we, which all makes our market even more important, because, and sadly, and this is not really to rejoice, but we have to trade more with each other because the world is closing in, and that is something very different. And then one last thing, you have IRA in the USA. It's very good that the Americans are dealing with climate change, because that's good for the atmosphere. But they're doing it in a very different way than we've been doing it in Europe, which creates new competitive challenges. So does China. So, to strengthen and coalesce and deepen this cooperation was important in the 90s, but it's just much more important now.
And the minister has made a lot of very good points there, and Mr. Šefčovič, perhaps now for the EU perspective on this. As I said, he just said the world seems to be closing in, and I wonder if you also share that impression. But I think when it comes to the EU, we hear repeatedly the idea of doing trade with friends, the like-minded partners. That is an expression that we hear repeatedly. How do you believe trade relations will evolve? And ultimately, how will you select those? And if I may say just very quickly, because Mr. Letta brought up this point, he did say in the next 5 years, there will need to be a sort of evolution in the way that public and private capital will come together and how to finance a lot of these challenges. Yeah. Do you believe that's going to happen?
Yeah. I think that we clearly have to act in that direction, but as you could see with the Norwegian minister, with Espen, we are a little bit more seasoned gentlemen, so I even remember the time when we've been just celebrating a few days ago the 20th anniversary of the Big Bang. Yeah. But I remember the time where me as a university student still didn't believe that it would ever cross the Danube to Austria. So really a lot has changed in the last 35 years, and it just proves, I would say, the vitality, necessity, and the success of the European integration. And indeed, this I was just teasing a little bit Enrico before we went to the stage that he's now the most quoted European, and I really mean it, because he made such a huge impression with his report, because I think he kind of touched on the basics. I mean, he clearly kind of presented a very plastic, I would say, image where we are and what we need to improve. And you are absolutely right with bringing it into the context that we are living in completely different world, as Espen has said just 5 years ago. We are still exposed to the, I would say, dramatic economic, political, and security consequences of the two wars, which are very, very close to our borders. And we are bearing much, much harsher consequences than any other major economy. At the same time, we went through the energy price shock, which brought the inflation, and I also would dare to say a lot of anxiety into our society. So a lot of, I would say, well-established policies are now much more under the question mark, and it requires engagement, explanation, and also sharing of the positive experience with our citizens, especially with the importance of the Green Deal and tackling the climate change. So we would need to level up to the current challenges, and we've been always the model student if it comes to global trade. We've been always respecting the international rule of law, international norms, how to trade. We've been always very faithful to the WTO framework. But we see that now it's not très à la mode, to use the French expression, and simply we would need also to adjust our tools, and we are doing that. Big thank you to Enrico is also for the highlighting how important the investment in the transition would be, and all the time, of course, you're asking the question where the money should come from. But I think that the huge focus, which was paid by his report, but also by the leaders in the last strategic agenda setting summit, was on finalizing the capital markets union. And I know that you heard it a lot. We've been struggling with that, I would say, between 7 to 10 years, if we look at it from the beginning. But the fact that 300 billion euros every year is invested in American enterprises and New York Stock Exchange instead of the best companies in the European Union just points to the direction that we need to do better and create a much more conducive environment for the European investors to invest in Europe. And the last point I would mention, because this is going to this leveling up direction, 2 trillion euros per year we spend on public procurement. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we want to kind of promote the European way of producing with low carbon, sustainably, treating the workforce decently, that we should also find a way how this would be reflected among the criteria of the public procurement. We couldn't spend 2 trillion euros, 14% of the European GDP, with always going for the cheapest alternative in the public procurement, coming very often from faraway Asian countries. Simply, we want the world to produce sustainably with low carbon footprint, and we want the social justice. So I think we should also use all our instruments, including public procurement, which is 2 trillion euros per year, to promote this type of modern 21st century production. So I think that the leaders are thinking in that direction, but it would require, as you rightly pointed out, adjustment to many of the policies which been still established when the world was functioning according to the rules, but it's not the case anymore, so we clearly have no other choice but to go in that direction in the next 5 years.
And it's definitely not a Brussels conference if the Capital Markets Union doesn't come up
Absolutely.
at some point. That is also very fair. But if I may ask you just very quickly, the journalist in me has to ask you, the Capital Markets Union, do you believe in the next commission that is something that will finally take flight?
I believe it because, I mean, as you saw, we kind of raised up to the occasion with the vaccines, with the energy crisis. I'm responsible for common purchase of gas, and we're going to do it for critical raw materials, for cables, for hydrogen, and this is such an absolute necessity right now that there is no other choice. We will succeed in this one.
Thank you for that. Minister Hassler, we saw in the video, and Mr. Letta also touched upon this, there is also a common thread that goes into the innovation, the tools that get put to that, even the sense of education and just the benefit of being able to study and do a lot of these things outside of your home country, but also in a sort of home continent for Europeans. How important is that to you? And I wonder if you could elaborate what your vision is.
So thank you very much. And first of all, let me congratulate all of us as the EEA family on celebrating 30 years of innovation and 30 years of creating together something which Enrico Letta already said, and we quoted a few times today, which is much more than just a market. I think if we are celebrating a birthday, we also have to talk about gifts. And I think we are really in a privileged situation, and our distinguished colleague Enrico Letta has made it clear that Europe's competitiveness depends on something immaterial. So our gift, our birthday gift, is relayed on something immaterial, and I think those gifts are the best ones. And I think I want just to highlight two competences which we also are celebrating today. It's about skills and about ideas. And I think we are also celebrating today that the EEA agreement has enabled all of us to contribute to European research, to education. You mentioned innovation, based on our participation in the EU programs such as Erasmus, Horizon Europe, Digital Europe, just to name a few. And I really believe that they build the basis that even though we are three comparatively small states, it's always relative if you are sitting beside Liechtenstein to say a small state, but comparatively small states, we really consist of very advanced economies with highly skilled professionals and very good research institutions. I think we saw that also when we could watch this wonderful video. So I do really believe birthdays are also an occasion to look back, and when we look back, we can be very proud of these achievements. But putting skills and ideas in the focus also of our celebrations today, I think we can also look forward into the future with a lot of hope. And we heard Enrico Letta before, that we can be positive and we can look forward with our strength. And I do believe, also being Minister of Education back home, I do really believe that ideas and skills are something which are not separating us, even though we are living in difficult times and even though we have a lot of challenges. I do strongly believe that ideas and skills are building the basis for unity and building the basis for a constructive way into the future. And I think, as mentioned before, this is a gift which we can celebrate and enjoy today, but I think it's also a gift for the further future of the EEA agreement, and I am sure we will not have a midlife crisis when we're celebrating 40 years anniversary. Instead of that, I'm sure that looking forward, celebrating the 60 years anniversary of the EEA agreement, with skills and ideas, we are also integrating the new generation. This generation who is going to shape the innovation and the creativity of this agreement in the upcoming next 30 years. So happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Well, thanks for that. And you also mentioned the Erasmus and Horizon, and when you asked Europeans, they're among the most popular programs. One of them that they always say they appreciate that it's a form of perhaps soft power too. Speaking of maybe not soft power, but hard power now, Ms. Gilbadottir, there's a question around the single market. Obviously, you've all said that you believe this is a gold standard and that this is a relationship that works in many, many ways. But externally, even from allies, but also countries that are not, you're seeing a world where the rules, even when you look at the WTO, are becoming less and less respected. So how do you counter that?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I would be even more powerful than I am today. But it is, I mean, this is probably the main challenge that we face. And I find myself, personally not having, I haven't really found the balance between, talking very openly about the importance of open economy. Iceland is a very export-driven country. We need the EEA agreement. We need to be able to trust the multilateral systems, WTO and all the others for us to be able to do business. And then again, we are also talking about we talk about China, we talk about de-risking, we talk about, and we see that we're moving in a more talks about economic security strategy, and how does that go in line or hand in hand? And you could also ask yourselves, eventually, which powers or countries are the most likely to secure their interests? And Iceland is not one of them, because we're small. That's part of the reason why we have to trust in the bigger system. So, at least for the EEA agreement, I think it's extremely important to ensure that we will not see fragmentation. So even though we see the developments and the EEA agreement changing, that has to be a common understanding and common investment from the EEA side and from the EU side that will not happen. Because we need to be able to trust that for us to be able to increase the likelihood that we will thrive. But it is also very important, the point that Dominic mentioned on the human resource and the education and the creativity. Because eventually, it all also boils down to the values, which I know is the second panel, but I just have to mention it again. Because if you ask yourself, what kind of societies are innovative? It's obviously the societies where individuals are free, because they can be creative. They're allowed to be creative. They have the freedom to think. They have the freedom to criticize. They have the freedom to do ugly art. They have the freedom to do mistakes. And this is not allowed in autocratic states. So again, when we have this foundation, and I know we're talking about free trade, single market and agreements, but eventually it all boils down to the fundamental states that we have to be able to build on. Because if we don't have that, we will very much miss the time when we had panels about how the EEA agreement would develop, or if we could pursue another free trade agreement, because this foundation is the true foundation. And with stronger cooperation between countries in the region, from political, business, education, Erasmus. I mean, in Iceland, 10% of people have taken part in Erasmus. I myself was an Erasmus student. So, with investing in that as well, it's more likely that we will be able to protect the good things we have.
And thank you for that. And Mr. Ede, just very quickly, because I saw you were nodding as you mentioned the need to avoid the fragmentation and maintain the foundations. I wonder if perhaps it's an area where you just want to have a final word before we move on.
Yeah, when I was nodding on that, it's because the three biggest markets in the world is the European, the American, and the Chinese, and you can imagine which one of this is most multilaterally oriented. It's not the American and the Chinese. So I go to what we do internally will also affect what we do externally and what we do with the world. But I just wanted to say that we are living in a time where we need to fundamentally transform our economies. And I think the report is very good, because you need to rearrange the relationship between market and state. It's not only how much state, but it's what does the state do. And basically the state can help in three ways: pricing of things you don't want, like emissions, subsidies and support for what you want more of, and regulatory frameworks, prohibition or standards. And on top of that, you will need to redistribute, so you need distribution as well. And where we are now, this is now really changing around. And you need a certain size, size is good, I think, in Europe, but you also need a certain cohesion. You need to be reasonably similar to be able to do that. And I think this is really the challenge of our lifetime, and I believe that the EU, and with that the EEA, is really now in the forefront of doing that. But we need to stick to the purpose, because right now it's the gold standard, but it will not be the gold standard if we give up halfway.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for that, Minister. And on that note, we are closing now the first part of the session, but I would like now to invite on the stage Rosa Balfour, who is Director at Carnegie Europe, for another keynote speech that will then set the scene for a more geopolitical discussion. Thank you very much, and a round of applause for her too.